Welcome to another paper theater build. This is one of the balls that I promised called Flying Boat Pilot Porco Rosso. It is a 3.5 out of 5 diamond difficulty, and this one's a little bit more of a tutorial since I haven't done a ball on this channel. So what's different about this is it comes in its own little case, which is they call it a ball, it's like a sphere that encapsulates your thing, and that little rubber thing is the stand that the ball goes on. Something that I will do and show in the video is I glue the stand to the ball when I'm done. Doing this, you can't really open your paper theater, but you don't really need to anyway. Now, I guess talking about the general construction, each paper theater has different layers that you have to build up, and paper theater balls have 4 layers, which I think allows for the easiest final construction of all the different types of paper theater kits that they offer. And also benefit to the paper theater ball is it comes with its own protective kit, while the other paper theaters you have to buy a separate one if you want something plastic to go around it. And right now you start to see my camera start to drift and then it falls, which was kind of scary but funny. Anyway, with paper theaters in general, a big tip that I have is every little sheet of paper that you have to cut your pieces out of, it'll say front and back. And not talking about that aspect of it, what I'm talking about is every piece of paper will have it will say front and back, but also have 1, 2, and 3 if it doesn't have the English version. And when the words or the lettering is in reversed, you should cut from that side because that is the quote back side of the piece of paper. In the cutting process, that's the ugly side. That's where I think it's a laser process, that's where the laser comes through, which is why, especially on the white pieces of paper, you can see some sort of browning on the back sides. And that's the side that you should have facing up when you're cutting because the lines are more visible, they're thicker, they're easier to cut through, and also if you do accidentally cut your paper, you're cutting the back side anyway. You're not cutting the side that you're going to see, so you can scratch up the back side and mess up, and it's very forgivable if you do it on the back facing side rather than the side that's going to show at the end of your construction. My next tip and advice, I guess, is using Elmer's glue or that white school glue. I personally get mine from the Dollar Tree, so it doesn't really have to be any fancy glue. And even if you do the paper theater wood styles, you don't need to have wood glue. My advice with the glue in general is to apply it with some sort of paintbrush. I always say go with a smaller paintbrush because it's very easy to spread glue out on a wide area, but it's always best just to have a small paintbrush, and I just use one paintbrush for everything, big or small parts of the piece, because overall it's only a few inches anyway, so you really don't need a large paintbrush. And as far as advice for using glue, the little plastic that comes with the paper theater kit that all your pieces of paper come in, I always spread my glue on top of that so I don't have to get anything that I have to wash. I can just throw that away anyway. And since it is paper, it's important that you make the layers thin enough to where the paper is not going to warp because it's so wet. And that's really only a problem on larger area things that you need the whole thing glued down, which is why several times in every paper theater video of mine, you can see me putting some random weights, like the glue bottle. I think this one you might be able to see me use a little stapler. Just something to weigh it down because it literally only takes maybe 20 or 30 seconds to dry sufficiently to where the paper will stop warping. But it is important that you have your whole piece of paper glued down and flat and pressed down while it's drying, because once your paper dries with the glue layer on it, it is much harder to get your paper theater final construction to work out. And it is especially important when you're doing the paper theater cubes or the balls, because a lot of times you have pieces that need to fit into pieces for the final construction, and if you end up making your construction too thick, it won't fit and your final project might be a little bit off. I also suggest when you're going to glue, especially if it's your first time making anything paper theater, to just double check the instructions and make sure you're gluing on the correct side that the instructions telling you to glue on, because once it's glued down and you have to rip it up, that's not good. Since it's paper, it will rip up part of the layers, so it's important to make sure you know what you're gluing before you glue, especially when it's the more 3D ones. The typical paper theaters, the typical paper one or the wood ones, those are more forgiving as far as the final construction. Like right now you see me working on this tiny little airplane, and this I think has 9 layers of paper. It ends up being a really thick little airplane. And especially that little rectangle piece at the bottom of the airplane, that part's really important that you glue everything correctly. And I didn't know, I was just following the instructions, but I didn't realize this towards the end of the construction, that little rectangle bit at the bottom, that actually glues into the base of the paper theater. It's covered with a glue bottle right now, but that little water part, that's where the that little rectangle there, that's where the little plain bit goes. And if you make your thing too thick or not lined up well, it is not going to fit in that slot. So it is important that your cutting is good. You really only have to cut those little notches, so that's not too difficult, but it's really important that your placement and your gluing is pretty good. And now for this bit of the video, I did slow it down a little bit, because this part, the instructions were clear that you only had to put glue on this one tiny area and those little rectangles at the top. I let it dry, so I'm moving on to the second piece, but those little rectangles at the top need to be opened up in a 90-degree angle on both sides, because that part actually glues to the bottom of this little airplane that we're constructing. And this is by far the most difficult part, because it is very tiny, as well as you're bending paper and making sure your glue is in the right spot. And this is the only difficult part that I encountered on this paper theater build. And you can see me kind of opening it up is not really difficult. It's not 100% flat, which was kind of difficult as far as gluing it onto the airplane. But overall, this build was pretty easy. And you actually have to put this little paper plane together, so if your gluing wasn't sufficient, it would be really hard to get all your little pieces in the correct spot. And this is not very typical of a paper theater. It's more typical of the 3-dimensional ones like the cubes and the balls. So I think maybe the cubes and the balls are a little bit more advanced. So if you haven't done a paper theater, I do suggest you do a regular paper or a wood one, because this one's more 3-dimensional and more specific instructions, and they don't always come with English instructions. But even when they don't come with English, it's really easy to follow the paper. You just follow the picture in the order that the arrows point. And I think it's pretty relaxing. This whole build took me about an hour, and I was kind of clicking on other things in between, making sure my camera was decent. And so even with all those distractions, this paper theater was rather easy to construct. And I guess now this is the last step as far as construction goes. So the piece with that water pond, that's the bottom part of the base. And now we insert the 4 layers. We slide them in. And I was having trouble with this 3rd layer because it was grabbing onto the 2nd layer. But in general, it's really easy. And then that piece that I'm putting in that says Studio Ghibli, that kind of makes it more secure. And at this point, I went ahead and started gluing the 1st layer onto the 4 layers, as well as this base layer too. Just a little bit for stability. And then put the final part that makes it into more of a ball spherical shape. My little I think it's called a propeller. My little propeller fell off again. But other than that, you then put the plane into that little rectangle that I mentioned, and it fit very well. And now the last part is the actual construction of the sphere. It's literally just two parts that click in together, but the back piece is this like semi-opaque sphere, and see those little notches? I kind of touched them, and I showed a little bit more clearer once I take it out, make sure it fit. Those little notches line up with the notches on the paper theater that I just pointed out, and that makes sure that your paper theater stays secure inside the ball and doesn't move around. And then the clear front part, you just click on the front. I'm just adjusting something that looked a little off when I put the ball on the front. And then this little rubber gasket looking thing, you just sit it on top, and you're not really supposed to glue it down, but I like my paper theaters. I like to pick them up and everything, so I always go ahead and glue it down. This actually is the longest part for me. It took about an hour for it to dry completely, and do not touch it during this time. And once it's completely dried, this is what you end up with. I was really satisfied with this. I really like Porco Rosso. I feel like it's one of the more underappreciated Studio Ghibli films, but it's definitely one of my favorites. It's goofy, I like it, and I've made 2 Porco Rosso paper theaters, and they're probably the more intricate ones just because of all the plain details and really thin lines. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this semi-paper theater ball tutorial, and I hope y'all do some art and have a good day.